Thank you. Hi, thank you for coming. Just to explain the format, we originally talked about this being just looking at 3 chapters that Liz wanted to talk about, and then having a Q&A as the last part of it. But I realised that if I was sat in one of these chairs, I wouldn't want to wait an hour to ask questions about things. So we're going to just slightly change that. So we're going to look at 3 chapters that Liz is developing and thinking about at the moment. And then as part of that, we'll keep bouncing it out there for questions. But it's a bit more free than we originally planned. So there'll be time for questions throughout the whole thing. I've been given a clock here. So if I get quite short in my sentences and a bit abrupt with you, it's not anything to do with you personally, it's because that's doing its thing next to me, and I've got to finish this thing by 6 o'clock. Ms. Lerman.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I'm ecstatic to be here, be in your presence, that you would come, that Emma would invite me, that I would get to meet you. It's making me think of the Passover Seder. You know, you keep saying it would have been enough, it would have been enough. It is amazing, and I'm ecstatic to be out of my own country. It is really different. It is entirely different, and if we decide to spend some time talking about that, we can. But I'm going to move on. I thought I would start with something that I've talked about a lot, and those of you who know me, you know this already. In fact, you can join the dance. You know it. But I sometimes feel if I miss it, then it's hard to get back. But before I jump into that, I've been aware lately that design thinking has taken over the world, this idea of design thinking. In our country, it's huge, and I know it's big over here. We just looked it up. It's been 50 years in the making. But I've been thinking, actually, the next thing should be choreographic thinking, because the world is in motion, because everything around us is in motion. The earth is shaking under our feet. Our institutions are changing. Our cities, our neighbors, who are we dancing with? Who's coming to see us? Where is it all happening? It's all in flux. And it makes me think that the things we know as choreographers have huge impact in the world if we could figure out when and how and in what form this knowledge should take. So a lot of my thinking and what I'm interested in talking to you about today is these frameworks for how we hold our knowledge, because we have so much of it. Sometimes I think we keep it in the shape and the form it's in because we are constantly thinking about the concert hall. And because we think so much about developing the work for the concert hall, all the mechanisms, all the things that it requires, the form of editing it takes, the nature of the kind of time we spend even in rehearsal and tech and all of that, takes the stuff we know and, well, I mean, it expands it for sure, but it also contracts it. So, you know, if we said, here's the concert hall up here, and here's, say, working community down here, we understand that this is important, but this is really important. Or, in our manner of thinking, we'll do this, and we say, actually, no. All that civic thinking, all that incredible way that people are thinking about responsibility and partnerships and how we build all that, that's where all our knowledge lives. And then we dismiss all this. Like, this is so impoverished, is it not? So those of you, I know, you know I'm going to do this, which is so easy to do with my hands. Right. Here, I mean, maybe now for 30 years, I've been trying to figure out how to do this and sustain this. Because in my early life, when I began to work with older people, because I needed to make a dance about my mother's death, and I needed them to be in it, because somebody had to welcome her to wherever she had gone, and in my mind, they were old. And so I went and found them. But, you know, they totally changed my life, because I thought I was done once the concert went up, and they said, what's next? 10 years working with them, and lo and behold, this began to happen. But I just want to say that we do this about everything. Nurture, rigor. We're in a collaborative period now, aren't we? It's all collaborative. What about the individual? In fact, I'm seeing students, they can't do anything alone. They only know how to work in teams. They don't even know where their voice is anymore, right? What did we do? What did we do? Now, if we have this, we make it a circle. There's lots of ways to move around that. So I want to talk about how we make this happen and sustain it. And just to be really clear, right now for me at home, this has become major because I'm interested in what I'm calling aesthetic equity. There's a lot of talk about diversity at home, and then there's talk about equity. Equity is when the system changes, not just the color of the people in the room, but the system itself starts to change. And how are we going to do that? What are the institutional biases and systems in place that make that hard to do? And I'm going to ask us in this room, how are we complicit in the way it's structured? I recently took a move to, I was recruited by our largest university to the American Southwest. I don't know if any of you have been there, but this is our desert. And there's a reason why people have renewal and visions in the desert. It is unbelievably beautiful. So strange. Mountains and I don't know, plants, like you just can't believe how weird my front yard is. I come out every day and I just, what are these crazy things? But I'm also living among people who've lived on that land for thousands of years. I know you have that, you also live among peoples who've been around for a very long time. It's new for me. These indigenous artists, the Latinx artists, the nature of how people, their history is just as bad as the history, say, where I came from, which is Baltimore. Nonetheless, there's just a feeling of such openness that I am really excited. So what I'm going to do is talk to Stephen for a minute, let him check in about hiking, this coming from hiking the horizontal. And then what I really want to spend time is some new thinking and some new frameworks. But let's just live in that one for 2 seconds or however long.
Great.
Okay? All right.
Because I got asked by Emma a couple of months ago to be part of this event, and so I went to the bookshop and I bought this, and I don't know how many people in this, no shows of hands please, but all to say, I've been making work for a couple of decades now, and there's something about reading a book where not just the questions, but the kind of fears that I still drag around. You don't just answer you don't answer the big questions, but you also posit new possibilities. And I think a lot of it is this idea, like you say, about the horizon line of something. I think what was fascinating to me was the idea that you refuse to think of community and concert hall, and you use the word concert hall rather than art centre or theatre or venue. So you very clearly state this expansive area in which you work, and then you are as comfortable strolling into any kind of venue or public space. And I think just because part of the book, for those of you who haven't read it, it's actually accounts of you being in these communities and then taking this show to here, and then the next chapter you've been to this kind of shipyard over here, and the next thing you're in New York performing. So there's something about it's an experiential account of what it is to be an artist, but it's also about accountability as an artist. Yeah. And I think in some ways that's what is precise and specific about this book that I don't think I've ever read anywhere, which is that double narrative going on. Yeah. So this is a thing that was so interesting to me, and I'm so short. I'm going to keep standing up, but the thing I don't like about this. And I want to just say, we learn our behaviors in this world. We may be trying to live here, but this is where we learn our behaviors, is a couple of things. One, if you want to make a distinction in this world, you have to literally put something down. If I'm going to make a distinction, I have to do it by saying you're less than this.
So even if the distinction is the difference between, say, community-based practice and dance therapy, which, by the way, not only is a creative distinction, an essential one. I mean, lives can be lost if you don't make that distinction clearly. I mean, maybe it's not so clear, it's permeable. But in this world, you can make distinctions without rancor. So that's the first thing. I think making distinctions is utterly creative, just amazing. I was telling Stephen, I was so excited to meet him. When Blackwatch came to Washington, D.C., I went to see it. And then a few Fridays later, I do a thing at my synagogue. It's been 20 years, one of my laboratories. Everybody just it's all participatory. And this old guy came up to me and said, Liz, I went to see Blackwatch, and he does what you do. And then he started doing the movement from the letters section. You know, it was just so incredibly beautiful. So just that the possibilities between like what happens in a synagogue and what happens in a formal theater, just critical to me that we can move through these things. Now, I have lots of constructs for how to make that work, and I'm not saying it's all equal. It's not all equal. What this does is allow you to have a big embrace and to say sometime I want to be in a room where you're in charge. It's total, well, I don't know if you do choreograph this way, but you're the author, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. And I want to sometimes be over here where it's a total collaboration between us and we're going to, that's what I mean. It's not that those things are equal. It's how do we want to use them, when do we want to use them. And in my sensibility, and I don't know how it is here, but at home, these distinctions are like cement walls. And it's really hard to move between them. So, for example, when my mother was dying, I wanted to make a dance that was spiritual. You know, I was trained up as a choreographer, but there was nothing in my toolbox for spirituality because by that time it had been ruled out of the formal canon. There was nothing there. So I'm suggesting we can change the canon. And one way we can change that is by how we hold our embrace. And now I'm going to talk more about change in a little bit. Yeah.
Are there any questions at this point? Otherwise, I'm going to ask all of them because I've got hours of questions. But is there anybody at this point would like to throw anything this way?
Yeah, do you?
Great, good. Thank you. Because I do have hours worth. To that point, there's again something that you talk about very freely is when choreography is at play and at work and is successful, and when your notion of theatricality is at play and is successful and in some ways because you're so familiar with it, you don't particularly announce it in the book, but I think what I noticed was that you blend it's like best idea wins kind of mentality, that you're using form in a way that's incredibly playful, but you feel like you've gone through a rigorous process, but you're not making the distinction between languages. But we were just talking at the back like school kids when you guys came in. But so all to say, there's a way in which you choose tools that for some people are over here and not in a good horizontal way. They're in an exclusive horizontal way. But at the same time, I was saying to Liz that there's a moment in the book where you talk about choreography killing people's interest and forcing people to leave theatres and audiences to walk away, is what you state in the book. And it was so interesting because I found you're so clear about it. And you're so generous about the fact that was something that was a problem for makers, language, what language are we using? We've got all of this here. But my question I guess is, do you think things went within the horizontal? Is it about the horizontal being in constant view rather than the horizontal being something you can pick from and stay there? Is it in flux itself as a construct because you have to be able to look along the lines of it?
Well, I would love it to be in flux. Don't you want it to be in flux? And in fact, you want it to get longer and longer and longer. Because sometimes I would say it's the extremes that are the most interesting, not a mushy middle. You know, where this became absolutely clear to me was when I had a daughter. And I suddenly got into that debate, working mother, not working mother. That's ridiculous. What? I love my work. I love being mother. What? You're going to make me choose? Stupid. But then, what happens? And there were lots of times when my daughter was not in sight. I mean, I was away for weeks at a time. And there are other times when she's backstage in the theater and we're together, and that's fantastic. And then big embrace. That's the first thing. And also the practice. Like it takes practice to live this way. It's sort of a constant question. But let's talk about language for a minute. I was totally shocked when I went off to school and was introduced to Cunningham. Because I grew up in the Midwest, and I was a Midwest lyrical dancer. Not lyrical the way it's described now, but in terms of my background was first was a little Martha Graham, and then a lot of classical ballet, and then eventually some version of modern, early modern, I guess you'd say. And it was just a total shock to my system, but I mean, once I got over feeling bad about myself, which is a constant activity to learn how to sort of filter out when am I going to allow the critique in and when am I not going to allow the critique in. Okay, but once I got past that, just the thrill to my body of all of that sort of nonsensical movement, you know, that suddenly it was just not anything like that was familiar to me. I love that. I didn't love everything that went with it. I didn't love the sense that perhaps one of our movement towards that kind of language of dance for its own sake was that we were tired of the emotionalism of Graham. Were we tired of the feminism of Graham? Were we tired of women? Is that possible? Maybe. I wasn't sure I liked the insistence that you could never have meaning, like never. I knew some people in his early company, and one of them said to me one day, oh yeah, he didn't want any stories, but we couldn't remember the movement, so we all had stories, like nonstop. We're like running around. We had lots of stories, which I kind of love. But what do we do with this idea of art for art's sake and the acceptance that that is enough? What are the values reflected in the idea that art for art's sake is enough if our definition of art keeps narrowing? I mean, art for art's sake is fine if art engages the public in I mean, there are lots of ways we could say, yeah, art for art's sake is really powerful. But somehow in that narrowness of that time. So one of the places I got to test this was, I was developing a company, we were starting to tour, so picture concert halls, picture all of that. But at the same time, I was an artist in residence at Children's Hospital in Washington, D.C. So once a week, I'd go to the hospital. So remember, this is me saying, don't diminish me because I'm at the hospital. But by the way, don't diminish me because I'm at the Kennedy Center. Don't do that. But it's going to be like this. My idea of a choreographer when I was going to the hospital is this. The most important thing was to invent movement that no one had ever seen. That was the responsibility of my generation of choreographers. Well, you know what? The hospital doesn't care about that. In fact, it could really injure the children. What they did care about was, can you sustain the movement for 30 minutes? Can you make something happen so that the parents can see that their children have beautiful bodies? Can you do something long enough so the children themselves feel like their body is not going to be a burden the rest of their life? Can you discover some way to include the nurses who might walk by for 3 minutes and then be gone? It's like sight work, right? We're in the middle of the hospital. It's total sight work, total immersion, complete immersion, like we have now going on at Sleep No More. I mean, it's the same thing, just in a different context. And what's the movement? So I found out that actually I would grow as an artist if I accepted those commissions, not shrink. Meanwhile, the kids who are, all bundled up and all those, they did do movement I had never seen before. They did. And it took an artist's eye to see it.
Just on that point, actually, because again, this thing that you do so beautifully is, I think of success as a certain thing, and you obliterated that. You talk in the book about a child that was asleep for 3 minutes. Do you just want to talk about that for a second?
Well, it's one of my favorite all-time stories because, I started this talk by saying I'm interested in choreographic thinking and what do we do with our knowledge. And I was saying I was worried that we were focusing it all in the performance. So when I was at Children's Hospital, which I stayed for 5 years, we never performed. I was performing. I was performing it as the teacher. There are all kinds of ways you could say what I was doing was performing, but in the sense of a formal thing, we weren't performing. And I was dismissive of myself for a few years about that. It took me a while to realize that it's okay, Liz, you don't have to be performing all the time. Something else is happening. So the last day of the 5 years, we had a concert by the company in the hospital, in the atrium. Everybody came. And I had been there earlier in the week and had spent time with the kids, and this beautiful child I had met fell asleep right in the front row with this very slow piece we were doing about bonsai trees, which the old people love, because the trees are older than they are, so they really love that piece. But this child went to sleep, and then, I was dejected, totally dejected, and I want to add that we have a measurement problem, because in this world, this is good and this is not good. What is the measurement in this world? I have a measurement problem. I didn't know how to really view what it was I was doing. So when I saw the child go to sleep, I don't want people to go to sleep in my concerts. She went to sleep. So I was really dejected, and I was leaving the hospital. This is after 5 years, and I'm just feeling terrible. And this nurse came running after me, and she stopped me, and she said, Liz, thank you so much. We have been trying to get that child to go to sleep. But this is the thing, right? My standard is, I grew up in a very revolutionary family, wake up the guards. Your job is to wake, provoke and all that. It never once occurred to me, along with Max Richter, who just made a sleeping piece, didn't he? Yes. That people need to sleep. Yeah. And that would be a good thing to make. Yeah. Yeah. And we did. Yeah. Bonsai trees. Yeah.
But also, just you're talking about the work you did with the children's hospital. In lots of ways, you're looking at, like you said, with the children, you're looking at there's a physical, there's a resistance physically. But then a lot of what you did, you went to a shipyard where we're not talking about physical resistance, which is one issue. You must have dealt with resistance on a whole other plethora of levels, walking into shipyards full of men whose jobs are about to disappear or are disappearing or have disappeared. Yeah. And you're talking to them about dance pieces.
Yeah. Well, look, the first time we went to the shipyard, they took us around. And this one guy, this is a repair shipyard, so the ships are in these enormous, huge bins kind of. And he's down there with his wrenches and stuff, and he looks up at me and says, oh yeah, I think of this as theater, look. It's not so far. No. I'm doing theater when I'm down in here. That was, just brilliant. So it isn't actually so far. But I do want to just say about resistance, and I would advocate that resistance lives in all of us all the time, and it's not just when we, go into a shipyard. But I think resistance is information. People they're just letting you know you're going too far too fast. At least this form of resistance we're talking about, not the kind that we might take up against my president. That kind of resistance is something else, but this kind of resistance. And it's an interesting problem to me to figure out what crumbs or boulders or things do I need to put there so that that person can come across. And I believe that's where we work our knowledge. That's the reworking of the knowledge that says, okay, what I just said isn't going to work. Let me try something else. And this is one of the reasons why I encourage so much that serious artists spend time outside of our little narrow things, because we can get into code words, we can get into flashes. Yeah, just do this. It gets kind of lazy. But when you're out somewhere and you have to say, now why does this matter? Why would it mean something to this person that he would come across and join us? And I have thousands of stories from the shipyard, but I would say one thing that I learned there was the power of, how much do we tell an audience and when do we tell them? This is a question not just in dance, although theater is less of it because it's so verbal, but the program notes in theater are even longer. I don't know, you're so verbal and there's so many notes, but you go to museums, is a big question. Like, where do they put the information up? Do you tell people what's going on the way out and hand them the program? No, they went on the way in. So at the shipyard, what we got to experiment with was origin stories. Who's there when you decide to say this movement means this thing? And how many people are going to know that? And it was thrilling to bring a whole community into the origin of each of these stories. So every story we heard got a movement. We kept teaching the dance for 18 months. So for example, this is the second movement in the piece. And this shipyard is where the Thresher, which was one of our nuclear subs, went down in a trial run. It's one of the first massive death traps of our contemporary age. And this community is deeply in mourning there. That's why, one of the reasons why I went, because the first night they brought me there, family members who had been, people who had family on the Thresher, and the engineers who had built the boat were in the same room, and they never had been in the same room, even though this thing happened years and years ago. So I got really interested in that. What's possible there? But this was a guy on the edge waving goodbye to his son, and the son gave us the movement. And that was the last time he saw his dad. So the whole community gets to do this. And as I point out to people, you could wave your arms, you could call it a stretch, you could say, I'm reaching, for something, or you could say, I'm saying goodbye. And giving communities the skills to put meaning into something and to take meaning away is essential. That's the only way we're going to keep those statues or get rid of those statues. Because when is the meaning there? When is the meaning not there? How am I going to help you move through the fact that the meaning is changing? We, in our world, we take this for granted. In fact, we love this. Aren't we excited in rehearsal where something turns into something else, it transforms itself, you go, yay, that's so interesting. But here's a community where, something stands. Now, they did better with the Thresher than they did with the prison. There was a prison on the shipyard, and we did a dance about it that we thought was hilarious. And they told me afterwards I could not make a joke about the prison. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And now comes the question, am I open to influence or not? Am I going to hold my artistic integrity and say, well, you can't tell me what to do? Actually, it was really interesting. I thought it was fun. I could not convince them that humor would help them understand the prison better. Nope, they weren't having it.
What was it about the prison that was giving them that response?
There's something about what it meant to them, and the building. The building is hideous, this giant thing in the middle, and they just weren't willing to allow themselves to find a different relationship to it. So I just think it's interesting. We did some, we did, but just back once more, this idea about this and its multiple meanings and what does that mean? I'm going to return to this later because I think this is one of our most powerful tools and possibly one of our scariest. So I'm going to come back to that.
I'm just going to throw one more thing at you. Mm-hmm. I might give you some questions. But there's something, you're talking about solving and solving issues in a room. And one of the things you talked about as well in the book was a group of students who were creating a piece about manifestos.
Oh, yeah.
And you'd asked them to burn a book.
Yeah, yeah.
In the book, you talk about the fact that you realise that there's a problem in the room and there's people that are resistant to an idea, and it's a creative idea, but it feels personal to them. And did you make them just say, I think, and then explain?
No. It's I changed the language a little bit. Yeah, those moments when you're teaching or you're doing something, you might be in rehearsal, but everything happens that you never thought would happen, and it's just awful. And all your tools, all the things you've ever done are not going to work. Well, actually, when you get to be a certain age, you're kind of happy when that happens, because it forces you. You have all these things to rely on, but this, So I was so excited about this side. We were brought in books. We had people reflect on all the things they love about books, because I was of the mind that if they're going to write manifestos, they need to get really angry and they need to break all the rules. So I said, bring in the books, and then I told them to tear the books up and cut them up, and they just went crazy. How can you tell us to do? They went crazy. And I said, okay, let's get in a circle. And then I told them to just take the words, I wonder why, and put that in front of whatever was bothering them. So if they were saying, I can't believe she told me to tear up a book, the most precious thing in the world. I wonder why it's hard for me that she told me that, like that. And the whole room changed because we turned all that anger and discomfort into inquiry. And those of you who know critical response process, this is really key to a lot of things for me, which is, yes, believe the complaints, believe the resistance, believe the problem, but can you turn it to inquiry? And as soon as you do, there's a possibility of fixing it. But before that, it's really hard. You've got to get to inquiry. Yeah.
It also touched on accountability, which is something I know we're going to talk about in a little while.
Yeah.
Any questions at this point? Go on, yes, go on then, go on.
You're funny.
Because you're talking about, once they're in the room, but how do you approach getting them in the room to start with?
Yeah. And who's the they, do you think, in that sentence?
I think it applies to, mainly, I'm thinking of community, but I guess it can apply to breadth.
Yeah. Well, I guess I feel partly it's how do we come to know anybody? And how do we establish common ground with people? And what are we asking people to do? Because do you like to go places you've never been before? Do you like to cross town? Do you like to go into a building that I was so, this little tour I'm on here, I've been in so many places. I made all the people who are bringing me, they have to walk me from place to place. They have to make sure I'm in the right room before they can leave me, because I'm so anxious about not knowing my way. So I want to ask you to just think about what's human. What just feels like a human way to go. There's a really interesting debate going on at home, maybe it's here too, about whether you need to be invited places now. Like, this idea that my mother died and I walked into a senior center and asked if I could come once a week. They did not invite me. There's nobody in 1975 that would have said, gee, we think old people should be dancing. There would never have been an invitation. But there is kind of there's a new wave of thinking about this work. And invitation is a big part of it. So I have a colleague at home who talks about studio practice, social practice, and civic practice, and makes those distinctions, which I think is helpful here. I'm more of a social practitioner than civic. I guess Children's Hospital would be an example of civic, where you're in residence, I'm completely there, whatever they need, I'm doing. I don't have my own ideas, I'm not trying to make anything. It's about the place. That's where that invitation, and that's where so much can happen. That's civic. Social is more when we have these ideas, we want to try something. I'm going to make a piece about veterans. Here I go. I'm going to go find them. I think that's where there may be some difficulties. And then studio practice, it's not even an issue. You audition, people come, you do your work. The audiences maybe come. It's not a given. So how are we going to get our audiences?
Certainly your accounts of, say, like the shipbuilding, they're years in creation, developing, creating performance, aren't they? They're long projects.
Yeah, I was talking to someone about this the other day. People think, transformation happens like that, and maybe it does, but not leading up to transformation. Mm-hmm. You want transformation to happen, it's not just going to happen like that. It happens because you're there for a long, long time. Yeah, we were at the shipyard for 18 months. We would be in certain communities. I think some of our best projects were when, I was at Children's Hospital for 5 years, 10 years at the Roosevelt, The funding sources right now are so bad and the measurement systems are so bad. You really have to decide that it's important to you. But even in the making of concert work and thinking about, how long are we, I hold companies together for 3 to 5 years when I'm making something. So I'm slow, but it also just takes, I know you were excited today because you get 7 weeks.
Yes.
And you're ecstatic about that.
Of course I am. I absolutely am.
Yeah.
But I guess in some ways what that points
you're
to as well is...
You're slipping out of this.
But there's something to point that point about, you've probably got a very, very keen sense of momentum in terms of creativity and process. What does that come from? Is that something that you've just had innate, or have you learned to develop a sense of what creative momentum feels like, and are you even aware of it?
It's a really interesting question, and the last part of what we're going to talk about is shape and momentum. So I'm going to leave this like a little cliffhanger, and we'll come back to shape and momentum, because that's a really important thing you're asking about. Yeah. So unless there's another question. Okay.
That's not.
Let's go to chapter 2.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. This one I need my notes for, because I'm trying to figure something out. And I don't have it yet. And I did it 4 times. When you're making a stage piece, what I just love is, you can layer things out and then you don't have to worry about sequencing. You just put it out there and people put it all together, as opposed to giving a talk where you have to do it in sequence. So think of this as like several things going on at once. But I do want to find my most recent note, and I think it's this one, yeah. So what do you think artists are doing when people thought that the universe was on the back of a tortoise? What do you think the artists were up to? Or what do you think the artists were up to when you thought the universe was made by God's breath, and you realize that actually God is the universe and God didn't have enough room, and so in order for God to make the universe, God had to contract, and so God did, and then there's a universe. What do you think the artists are making in that kind of world? Or what are artists making when the universe is a clock? Or what are artists making when the universe is a network? Like, I'm interested in what part do we play in supporting the belief systems that are around us? What part do we play in contradicting them? And how are we complicit in what those systems are? So I got thinking about this when I started working with the geneticists, because I did a big, long project, concert piece with lots of other things that went along with it, but it's a huge, big interdisciplinary project that toured for maybe 5 years. And the geneticists were just incredibly interested, and I got into their labs. I got to spend a lot of time with them, and I really got to know a lot about genetic engineering. And I began to wonder, well, wait a minute. Is postmodernism partly responsible for a world in which genetic engineering is at play? You know, taking things apart, taking them more apart, putting them back together. What does that look like when we put them together? Ooh, what did we just make? Oh, what is that? Like that. So this was the beginning of this question that I want to pose to you, which is, where's our complicity? And I'd like to take you through just a couple of ideas about that. When I was touring the genetics piece, we were somewhere at a university, and the head of the physics department came up to me afterwards, and he said, well, we want one. And I said, no, I'm done with science. And he said, no, I really, come to our meeting tomorrow. So I went to the physics meeting the next morning, and I have to say they were all on time, which is one of the things I loved about physicists. and because I thought, oh, physicist answer is time, good. It's like stuff, okay. But at that meeting, they said to me, you know, you really have to do this because you have to go to CERN, you know, where they're smashing the particles. They said, because we're going to figure out how the universe began. And I said, fantastic, but what are you going to do about the other origin stories? Like, what's your job about that? Do you have any responsibility to anything that anybody else might be thinking about that when you do that? And that actually became one of the core questions of this project, is where does that hang, and what is that? Now, while I was doing this project, I also got involved with the National Institutes of Health, and they were going to do a big thing about Charles Darwin, and then they decided not to spend so much money on the arts. So I had a little tiny bit left, and I decided instead just to make the piece about Charles Darwin's wife, Emma, who is just an amazing person. And there's a beautiful book called Darwin and His Daughter, if you're interested in more of this, just amazing stories. So Emma Darwin didn't think that she would be able to be with Charles Darwin in the afterlife because of his work. And she grieved. She just grieved. So I sort of picture, what's it like? He's out for one of his long legendary walks, you know, he's thinking about all this, and he comes home, and there's his wife, and she's mourning the thing that he just spent 10 hours thinking about. I think it's one reason why he took so long to publish, is actually living with her and what was happening. She wasn't the only one having trouble at that time with these ideas. That in that time in your country, all kinds of people were exploring, and they were sending all these animals back. You probably know this, but just crazy looking creatures that were coming in from all over the world. And the people who believed in the Bible, which most people, got really upset because they couldn't figure out how all these animals could live on Noah's Ark. They couldn't figure it out. And then they thought, I mean, it's laughable. It is laughable, except if you're them. It's not laughable. It's like, wait, my entire belief system. They even started to think that they had the measurements wrong. They were willing to change what the measurement meant of that boat so that they could get all those animals on there. Like, I think this is phenomenally interesting, really interesting. And I think about it now. Like, what's happening? There's so much going on. What's happening to our people? How are they handling all this? How are we handling it all? So we got a commission from the Harvard Law School to make a piece about human rights law in honor of the 60th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials. Now, when the woman who's now, she just stepped down from the dean, somebody that I've known for years, she called me, she said, Liz, let's work on this together. I actually turned her down. I said, actually, Martha, I think there's a limit to what art can do. I'm not sure I can do that. But she was insistent, and here's why. She said, we're going to bring together all the human rights people in the world, like 350 people who think about genocide 360, all day, all the time. She said, but she thinks they've forgotten it's about the body. So she has this instinct that actually we need bodies in here to make that, and that really got me. So I asked her if she would help me do the research, and she said she would, and so we researched together. And in this, I decided this was not a Holocaust piece. I wasn't going to do that. We started with Nuremberg, and we kind of went through an evolution about human rights law into the whatever day was being performed. Then we ended the piece with something that was happening that day, and maybe one of the criminal courts or something like that. And why we were doing this, she had done some work on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which, I don't know if you knew this, I was shocked when I found this out. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, in order to do, and I don't know if we have South Africans in the room, I know many people feel like they didn't go far enough, it wasn't good enough, there are all kinds of issues with it, but for the moment, if we just say something happened with that was effective, they had 4 definitions of truth in order for it to work. So the 4 definitions they had were factual truth, what's the facts, what actually happened in that during that period, what's the forensics, like what are the bodies that are buried showing. This is particularly true in Rwanda. They did a ton of forensic work to figure out what had happened. Sorry to tell you that many people just had their Achilles tendon sliced so they couldn't run. That's what the forensics show. So factual truth, forensic, narrative truth, which is each person telling their own story in their own manner. And then the 4th one, which is called social truth. I didn't understand social truth until, as I mentioned to you, I was living in Baltimore, and I was there during Freddie Gray, if you recall that Freddie Gray was a man of color, picked up by the police, thrown into a van. Things happened while he was in the van. When he gets out, he can't walk. He dies a day or 2 later. It caused all the recent uprisings that happened in my city. Yes, what are the facts? He gets picked up, he's put in a van, he can't walk when he gets out. What are the forensics? They did amazing forensics on this man's body. Said a lot about what they did to, how they didn't keep him restrained in the van, and the van drove very rapidly, big turns. Narrative truth. He didn't get to tell his story, but his family did. He grew up in a house where the lead poisoning was like this. I mean, and then the social truth. And the social truth was the city trying to figure out what to do. That's what I felt was happening. It's like you live amidst it. They're arguing and change. I mean, just so much happening. And I don't think we found it. What I do know is in relationship to the social truth is that you heard the word healing, and it turns out healing in the white community went one thing, but healing in the black community was not good. What, you're gonna heal us so it can be like it was? Like that? So just massive, okay. So I use this as an example of something that I learned because I'm making art. I'm making a piece of art. I do research, I find out these things are amazing to me. They begin to fill me with knowledge. So it's not just the knowledge of the shape and the line and the energy and how the dancers go in a circle art for, it's not just that. It's the knowledge we gain because of all this work we're doing, and then what do we do with it? So I think the fact that I now know this and I'm passing this on to you is really interesting. I did pass it on in the context of the concert piece, but I pass it on more often when I'm giving talks. So where we put in our knowledge, how are we sharing it? But here's my question. How am I complicit in a president who thinks there's fake news if I believe there are 4 definitions of truth? How am I complicit in this? How is my love of ambiguity? In fact, I would go so far as to say in formal artistic practice, one of the things we say is your didactic is like the worst thing you can say about somebody because they're just giving you one way to think, right? People hate that. Your skin crawls. I get called didactic a lot, actually. I think it's because because I have a voice. That's why I think they call me didactic. But anyway, that's interesting. Huh? So I'm asking, what does it mean if we have these artistic tools that are so powerful for us and so amazing, and that we live for them and we make them? And I'm telling you, I'm not giving it up. I love I'm not giving up ambiguity just because I am a president, like I do. But I am curious, what does it mean? And what is my responsibility? And is there something I need to be doing besides being ambiguous that could help us not be in the situation we're in? And that's where I want to pause with that question of how are our artistic projects, remember what did artists do in the time of the turtle, and what are we doing now, and what's our implication? So,
Then we'll to respond to that.
yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to think about that.
I know she just dropped a bomb in the room, because I knew she was going to ask that question 20 minutes ago, and I've been shaking about it ever since. Yes.
I've got some ramblings. I don't know if it's a response.
Go.
Give me like 3 seconds ago. I feel like if ambiguity is kind of like the atmosphere, and you relate that to the present, the thing that I think of is who's in the room. Because I think, like, just to kind of be clear, like, I think having been trained here in London, in a dance school that is mostly concerned with practices of a very Western way of thinking, I've always found them very, in some ways very foreign to me, and the cultural thinkings of, let's say, my whole life, broadly speaking. And I see the ways in which that space develops its ideas is on this like homogeneity of thinking. So I guess if there's too much ambiguity, then I would imagine that there's not a good enough mix in the space. And like, I guess I say that like thinking about people saying, can Black artists or African American artists from this specific context be abstract artists? And the argument was that they can't be abstract because they've got too many things to resist, too many things to focus on, so people wouldn't give them the space to do abstract art. And I wonder if that thinking can relate to this thinking about ambiguity and a mix of thinking.
Yeah, you're raising a lot of things in that statement. Many. It's just going to be an odd response, but you know, when I work with the physicists, one of the things that puzzled them at the beginning of the Big Bang is that all these particles are running around and they can't figure out what makes the particles come together and stick. And then, you know, it takes millions of years and they stick and more things stick. And then we're spending time trying to figure out building nuclear bombs so we can unstick them. Like literally, it takes that much energy to unstick them. Sometimes I think assumptions are like that. The assumption that a person of color cannot make abstract art is an assumption. And it has come together somehow, so strangely, that it's going to take so much energy to break it apart. But it is not the truth. It's not the truth. And that it's just, so I'm saying it's not the truth. I don't know which of the truths. But how we assemble this knowledge, and then how do we support each other to move past these kinds of things where you would feel that way. Just as I feel on my side of the ocean that a white woman is supposed to make abstract art, and if she tells a story, me, let's be realistic here, you know, much less funding, for example. It's just not there. As if I'm not supposed to be able to have a voice. Where do these things come from? What perpetuates that? And which part of the system is at play? What do we have to do to change it? And that's we're going to get there in the next round. But yeah, it's a really good question.
Yes.
I mean, I think a lot about this issue too is about ambiguity in relation to the supposed fixity of truth. And I think all of it comes back to two things: the horizontal, because ambiguity to me is a horizontal way of knowing, because it's an accommodation to not knowing. It's a holding as equal more than one possibility. And of course Donald Trump can't do that. He's completely unambiguous in his thinking. And so if there's a skill that goes back to this whole thing that you talked about at the beginning, that choreographic thinking, which I also think of as dramaturgical thinking, is thinking based on movement and relationship. And it's thinking that happens in a context. And these are skills that we can learn, and they are movement skills, and they are skills of mental movement. But we have to be really active in breaking down all of or making porous all of the seeming boundaries between those things. The ways in which we think are the ways in which we move. And we're so constrained in our thinking and our movement by late-stage capitalism, by everything that it requires of our compliant bodies and minds. So, I don't have an answer for it, but I certainly think that ambiguity belongs on the horizontal,
Right.
and is part of the sustenance, the holding up in the hands that we all have to practice, but we also have to communicate all the time.
Yeah, Ruth is mentioning as part of this skills the idea of context. I have a friend at home, Roberto Bedoya, who's a wonderful poet and a really interesting man, who talks about the sovereignty of context as a way of thinking. And when you think about going here, then you think about that context. I said this the other day, though, and said that in the UK you have to be careful of the word sovereignty. And so I said, okay, great, multiple words for the same thing. Let's think about, and multiple words for the same thing to me is one of the great creative tools that we have. And again, it leads to ambiguity. It could lead, multiple words for the same thing, you could say is political spin. You could say that. So then what does that mean, and how do we account for ourselves? Of course, Ruth mentioned some other things in your view of how that goes, and I also have some thoughts about that. But I do think it's a question about when do we decide accountability is part of our world or not. And I would advocate that in this world, the way we've been practicing in the arts world for a very long time, art for art's sake, is actually accountability. Yes, accountability to our designers and to the people in the show, and maybe to our audiences, and certainly to our patrons, and maybe our funders. But really, where do we practice some forms of accountability with what we know in the world?
I think when I was talking to you earlier, that's when it really kind of knocked me, was which you were talking about as an artist, how does one respond? Which I think most people in this room have been pushed into a corner, whether they're on this side of the pond or the other, where there's a certain sense of that in the air for creatives. Where you're kind of tipping into slightly more incendiary territory is you're talking about artistic accountability, which is kind of an altogether different minefield. Because it's about not what do we do, but what did we do? So it's a reflective exercise, and I think that's the point at which I certainly start to get a bit shaky back there, thinking, certainly for us, in the last 18 months we've had a kind of very difficult episode. Did we take our eye off the ball as artists, as a community, as an ecology? Are there things that might have been implemented differently, or just thought about differently, or played out differently? And again, it's that thing that is completely in line with your thing. Like it's not the response and accountability. It's all the same thing, really. And that's why I think the book is so evocative in that sense. But just the idea about, in the event of something like this happening, and the first thing you said today was, you talked about the country that you're from, and the fact that in some way, as an artist, you're clearly thinking about yourself, responding to a country, but also feeling responsible in some way for a country. Is that fair to say? Yeah.
Yes. I don't feel absolutely responsible for Donald Trump.
I hope you don't.
It's possible I didn't do enough as a feminist to stand up for women and to help make it clear that it's okay. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons why he got where he got to. So I'm not sure about that, but I am thinking that what I might do about it, and here's where responsibility and accountability, I'm not saying go out and do politics. I want us to be responsible to our knowledge and our tools. I want us to be able to see that we can deploy them in ways maybe we haven't. So here's an example. I thought during the campaign, it's not just he's a narcissist, that's what everybody thought. I actually think that he's an abuser, and that it's like being in a relationship with an abusive person, which I only know. I was in one for 10 hours. My family set me up on a blind date, and I can tell you, 10 hours it was It taught me a lot. And the way I reflect back on that. So I started actually looking into this, because you know, when you're in an abusive relationship, you keep thinking it's going to get better. Then the person does something nice. They bring you flowers. He reads from a teleprompter. And everybody thinks, hey, he's presidential. And then whap, whap, whap. So what is it for us to be, let's just say for a minute, we're in relationship with a domestic abuser, the entire country. My feeling is that I don't need to make a piece about Donald Trump. I don't need to make a piece about any of that. What I might need to do is to do many more participatory art events so people who are depressed can come out of their houses and do something creative together and feel connected and to see themselves as human for a minute, even though this horrific thing is going on. Maybe that's, and that's not something I don't want to do. I don't really want to do that, but I mean, that would be an example of how I might reconceive what I know and what I would do. And that, you know, so just one idea.
I'm aware of time here, Liz.
Oh, we have to go on.
Should we go
Yeah.
to part 3? Is there anything before we jump here?
I'll just say I'm doing some work with an amazing artist named Mark Bamoudi Joseph. Some of you may know him. He's a Haitian-American slam poet and dancer choreographer who also is a curator at one of our big art centers, Yerba Buena in California. He and I have been working together, and we have this thing we're cooking up. We borrowed it from some rural poverty work, which is an idea of a values chain. A values chain is when you have a set of things that you love, like they do it, they talk about 7 riches in a community, and you agree that you aren't going to raise the riches in one area at the expense of another. So for example, gentrification, you are raising the built wealth at the expense of social wealth. So you can't do that. If you have a values chain, you have to set up a deal where you agree not to do that. And they have so Mark and I got going on this idea about, if we thought about it for ourselves, what are our aesthetics, which is a big thing. What are our aesthetics? What are our personal values? Where is our social accountability? And what are we going to do about our systems? Now, he talks institutions because he runs one. I'm a solo artist, although now I'm associated with the university. But you know, what are the systems by which I put my work out? And he says, what if we had a values chain? So yes, you can work on your aesthetics, but not at the expense of your social accountability. Can't do that. Or you can, you know, it's interesting, huh? It's interesting to think about what even just that one little idea might do. Of course, we're going to advance our aesthetics at some point and leave everything behind, maybe, but maybe before we deploy that new thing, we might put it back in relationship. As I mentioned, I'm in the Southwest, and one of the people I've gotten to know, I just love, is an indigenous philosopher who says aesthetics is what a people think is good, beautiful, and true. Now, the good, beautiful, true part, we know that's from the Greeks. But what he changed as an indigenous person is that word, a people. He's still in touch with his people, a people. That really got me thinking. Like, I think downtown New York is kind of a people. And the aesthetics, what downtown New York holds as good, beautiful, and true is real. It's a thing. Now, it happens to be up here and dominate the world for a long time, but there are all kinds of other peoples with amazing ideas about aesthetics and what could happen. And that's, I think, what we heard from the young woman in the back, like a yearning for some other way for these aesthetics. And I think we could look at a values chain in relationship to our systems. Okay, so we're going to leave that. Thank you for letting me try that out. I'm really trying to work on this complicity factor. So if you have thoughts about this later, I'm really happy to hear from you. I don't know if I have time for the short or the long version. What do we have?
We have about 20 minutes.
Okay. So when I was little, I got nightmares. And the nightmares, it's funny since I'm so narrative-based, but the nightmares were abstract. The dots were coming for me. And my room would be like these swirling dots, and I would scream and my mother would come in and she'd soothe me, touching me right here, which I learned from some other people recently. Their mothers did too, which is nice, and the dots would go away. I mention this because, now I kind of see the world in dots. It's funny, they've come back, but as my friend, I don't know if I'm under the influence of the geneticists, because, you know, they're dropping everything down to DNA, or the physicists and their particles, or my love of postmodernism, but I think of things as dots. So this is an example. I am sometimes wrongly, but sometimes credited with starting old people dancing. Okay, old people have been dancing for thousands of years. We just forgot, in a small part of the world, at a certain time, in a certain kind of dance, in a certain thing. But there I was with a dead mother, grieving, and there I was with a bunch of old people, and I put two dots together, my little dancing dot and the little old people dot, and I drew a line, and I said, I'm going to connect these, because they'd been separated. It's a little bit what we were talking about. They'd been separated. I drew a line. And because I stayed there for 10 years, you know, I wasn't the only person. And Bill T. Jones put his mom on stage. Suddenly there's two more lines. And then other people came and visit. And then you start to see that people are making these connections, and there starts to be a shape. So what had before been just dots started to become a thing, a shape. If you work with physicists as an artist, you will eventually come to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which I'm going to, if we have physicists in the room, they usually, they roll their eyes when artists get a hold of it because they don't think it's metaphor. But they're like, this is a bad version of it, but my version of Heisenberg is this. If you measure the shape of something, sometimes you say a point, but I'm going to say a shape, you will miss the momentum. And if you measure the velocity of the momentum, you are going to miss the shape. You can't see it. Isn't that interesting? You measure the shape, you won't feel all this. You go for this, it's hard, you can't stop it long enough. In fact, I kind of think that's what choreography, actually a lot of choreography is about that. And maybe even a lot of art is about that, right? We're just catching the flow. Can you see this? Can you see this before? So I started thinking first about dancers, because I think at the time we were working on this, I really felt we had in the company shape dancers and momentum dancers, but hardly anybody could do both. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to do that, which was fascinating. But I gave more thought to institutions and how institutions are a shape. And then they hold on to that shape. And then the world is changing, like all this momentum is happening, and they cannot fall back into it. They can't find that momentum because this shape is like. So I've been wondering, like, what dots could they disconnect? What dots, could you disconnect? Maybe you don't lose the whole institution, but what do you have to do to be able to drop back down into it? And by the way, if you're all momentum, it's just all innovation all the time, no one can see it. There won't be a thing there. There's nothing there. People can't tell it happened. So I was really interested in this. I decided to bring it up at a faculty meeting. And I said, I think that our shape is wrong. I think we could break our shape apart. And there was hysteria, especially from the old timers who'd been there for a while. And one woman who finally said, but Liz, we can change okay, let's do it, but we won't change the fundamentals. We won't change the fundamentals. We'll keep those. Those will be the dots. And I said, well, I don't know. I think the fundamentals may have gotten us into the trouble we're in. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, here's an example. I was first a classical dancer. Well, that's not true. I first did a couple of years with Ethel Butler, who had danced with Martha Graham. But then I became totally entrenched in classical ballet. And I was told that if I studied classical ballet, I would be able to do any dance in the world. I'm so glad you're laughing. So of course, I can't do at least half the world's dances, if not more. I mean, I can, I can rework my molecules, I can figure, but I'm like all up here. If you tell me to start anything, I'll just be, and so much of the world is down here. It's a fundamental flaw. So there has to be more dots broken up there than just the fundamentals. But the thrill of it, I believe, the thrill of this is the freedom we would find if we could drop away some of that shape, sense the urgency of the times that we're in, and then create the shapes that we need to have to be able to do this. So I was with a bunch of orchestra people once, and somebody in the room said, well, you know what? There's always going to be music, but there may not always be orchestras. That's an example. Now that's a huge change, but it may be coming. It may be coming. So I think one thing about this shape and momentum is to be excited by it, to see how each one of us, could, reimagine ourselves and our world and our work, and maybe it helps get at some of these structural problems that are holding us here and not here. But I'll see what you think.
Any thoughts there? Just to that point, I've just been working on a piece about Heisenberg, actually. So
let's go.
I've spent 4 weeks trying to figure out actors and Heisenberg. But anyway, you're talking about institutions and even your own company. Mm-hmm. Does that actually come down into a rehearsal space environment or to a creative environment with, for argument's sake, an elderly room of people?
Yeah. Or I think it affects everything. I think you can conceive of the shape of the rehearsal, or the shape of the rules of the rehearsal, or the assumptions that people hold in relationship to that. Like the shape of rehearsal may be, I'm always in charge, and you guys whatever. Or it could be a series of things that work through that. I know at Dance Exchange, we thought we were an amoeba. We changed our shape so often. But I think rehearsal halls are actually a great place to practice this. And I think that was one of my frustrations, which moving into the theater world for a little bit, was the difference in the rehearsal room was so different from what I was used to. And I could not adapt to its shape.
Yes.
I was going to ask, have you ever experienced a morphing of the two? So I've been in a space where it is all one person, and then all of a sudden we all break into problem solving, and it ebbs and flows.
Yeah, and what are the rules of that? How does that work? I think it's fantastic when that happens. That's a really good example, actually, of the horizontal. So what makes that possible?
I don't know. I think we all entered into the space understanding
how
that it was. It was magic. I don't know, because I wasn't the leader. I wasn't the person who set up that room. I was only the person experiencing it. I don't know. And I was too young to really identify what was actually happening. But
well, I'm going to encourage you to go figure out what the magic is, because the magic's repeatable. The magic is, you can have that magic every time if you want it. Something with, what was your personal experience? How did that work when you walked through the door the first time? What had been established? What was going on? It's true, at Dance Exchange, it was kind of an osmosis. So after a while, I didn't have to do much. The people kind of got it from each other or something like that. There was a kind of osmosis. But I really, I know that we love magic. And I'm making a piece about magic right now. I love magic. But I actually believe these things are applicable, repeatable, harvestable, catchable, if we ask ourselves about it. I do.
There's something that I think I garnered from hearing you talk and what you wrote about process and rehearsal rooms. And it goes to what you said about it, rather than the horizon line, think of it as being an embrace. You seem to have that ability to lead from the front and push from the back. And sometimes you're doing it in the same sentence within the book. Yeah. But I had this image of you just revolving around the outskirts of a rehearsal room, 360, 360, 360, 360. And so in some ways the viewpoint of a rehearsal room, and therefore its process, is not about we're all facing one way and you're 5, 6, 7, 8, but you are literally you're looking at it from all angles, and verbally, vocally, spiritually, in terms of just the geography of the room, also the ideas within the room. There's times when you are very clearly, it's here, and other times like you've just done just now, it's like you seem to have this ability to just not step back from the responsibility of it, but certainly get behind it, and then at other times be very clear and this way forward.
Right. So the horizontal is it can it lives in lots of ways. So it gives me freedom to be absolutely authoritarian or absolutely not, and everything in between. Gives the piece a chance to live that way, because a piece is in an arc, and you may want one kind of thing happening, and then it changes, and then it changes, and it changes. So you want people to be flexible and ready and have the capacity to move between shape and momentum. I really think. Yeah. And that's why I was asking you how it happened, because I think it takes a certain amount of verbalness. I have to tell you, I had this amazing experience. The dance appellate sent me to King's College to do some work, I think that was yesterday, and I met with a neurobiologist or a neuroscientist. I forget if he's a I forget the second half of his neuro, but it's, he's totally excited guy, because he's working with embodiment. And he's begun to use embodiment as a way to teach what he's trying to teach. And he is describing to me a total, this happened. I mean, he doesn't know this, but it totally happened. And now, why did I want to tell you about this? Oh, so he said to me, now Liz, I read a little bit about you, and you do these things called movement mnemonics. This is when I tell people, you hear a story, make something to help you remember the story. And I call it a mnemonic, like a little memory device. He said, I don't think you should be doing that. He said, you don't need the words, you don't need the memory. It's all in the body. So he's giving me this whole lecture about the body knows. And I was fascinated. I thought, this has gone full circle. I only talked about new movement mnemonics so that people like you would come along. Now, he's like, and then you guys, he said, artificial intelligence is realizing they can't do it without bodies. They're bringing bodies to artificial intelligence. They can't do it. That's really, really interesting. Now, why I got into that from where you asked me, I'm not sure, but it's just so thrilling to me to see the kinds of things that are happening. But I want to just say, this means you have choice. This means you have an arc. This means you have, and that you don't have to diminish yourself or your processes because you're operating on some false hierarchy that actually may be holding the wrong values in place. Right?
There's something just about bodies that I just really flagged up for me earlier when you talked about the woman who said that in order to tackle a subject matter, it needed bodies in order for it to be palpable or even possible. And I think there's something that fascinates me certainly about bodies and choreography and movement. And on the bigger spectrum, I remember watching the Olympic opening ceremony in 2012, and when we really wanted to speak about what our nation was, how did we do that? And it was choreography. We didn't pay anybody and all of that, but that's not, But it strikes me that sometimes the only possible way for it to be read, if we're talking about things that are enormous or emotional in even the smallest sense. Your book goes to this quite a lot. It's the human body that actually holds all the kind of aspects of that we need to communicate.
Right, and I just want to say now I remember why I mentioned the man from yesterday, because he was saying even though he believes in all this embodiment, you still sometimes need language in order to come to each other. Mm-hmm. But when we had this horrible shooting in Las Vegas, I thought to myself, gee, maybe it's time to make a dance for the survivors of all these things. And it would not need language, it wouldn't need, it just, I think people would come and move together for that. No, actually the whole country probably would. No, except for the NRA. But
now, Liz, do you want to talk about, because we've got 10 minutes left, do you want to talk about
let's
risks?
lay a couple hands, let's do these, and then I'll just...
questions and everything, look at you. 10 minutes to go, you've showed up. Yes, lady here. I'll come to you in 1 second. Yes.
I'm fascinated to know more about what you think about sort of passive and active audience members in terms of the thing you've talked about, like transformation and turning things around and all these distinctions, and then just the example you just gave now, thinking about context and how much choreographic thinking revolves around context, and there's all this exploration about what is the audience role within the work, and so I'm interested to know more what you think about how we kind of navigate that spectrum of work that and not giving it better or worse value whether the audience is how involved they are, but that sort of active versus passive audience relationship in relation to the effectiveness of change, like to actually make change.
Do you think there's any other words you could use in addition to active and passive? What other words might you use for what you're describing in the audience?
I guess what I mean is this thing about extracting meaning. So you just gave the example of the what you could make in terms of people, people mourning loss of death, and that wouldn't need words. You could go beyond words, and it could be a really meaningful experience. But that's all about context. If we know what the context is, then we can afford all kinds of abstraction in a way.
Right.
So I guess what I mean is...
So do you think maybe it helps to let people in on the context?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the issues for us is exactly that, and back to what do we let people in on. I'm not exactly sure why it became so important you would be a better artist the less you said about it. I don't know where that came from. I mean, and I also know that we can overdo it. We totally can overdo it. So it feels to me it's kind of an art, it's part of our art making to figure out what we say when and how and to whom and in what form and who's doing the saying. So I would say experiment, experiment, experiment and see what you find out. In my own work, we have played with audiences doing immersive stuff and then sitting and watching, which they love. Totally got, each character had its own room, its own details. People got really close to the characters. They came out on stage and then they sat down and that was phenomenal. I think that was really, gave people so much. It was like an animated program note. We've also done things where the audience has, Act 1 is in chair and Act 2 is tea, and there are people at every table, the scientists and artists and the dance, stuff like that. All of which I just think people just really interested in all that. But I just want to be careful we don't just do this around immersion, for example. I have an interest, just a thought about the immersive work. I've been thinking a lot about editing and how, in my early years, so much of the tools that I gave people was about generating, helping people generate, feel good about themselves as creators. And I find that a lot of young people, they generate like crazy. That's partly from the linking and they just, but they're not very good at editing. They're just really not. Even tweets, you do 50 tweets or something. But then we make a thing like immersion, and I wonder to what extent are we also handing the editing off to the audience now? And sort of back to this question of our artistic responsibility to the notion of honing and all that. I'm just very curious about it as a question for myself. But I would advocate that you experiment with this idea and play with what you mean by active passive, because I'm not sure people are passive when they're sitting in an audience. I think or if you think they are, what can you do to fix that? You're still going to sit in an audience, they're still going to watch something you made, they're still going to commit to coming for an hour and whatever it is. But are they being passive? And if so, that's a different question than are we just trying to give people lots of experiences? And I would say nice little spectrum to play on. Yeah.
Can I ask you to bullet point a question from the back there? It's going to be our last one now in our closing minutes.
I'm interested in what you think about, or how do you think you can encourage people to change their fundamentals? Because I think with things like Trump, and in this context, Brexit, there is a moment for everyone to think about new ways, but I feel like I'm just seeing people rebuild old structures. I'm not seeing, and we're being asked as artists and dancers right now here in Brexit, like, what do you need? And I feel like everyone's talking about how to make sure people who have passports keep passports, but nobody's saying let's become no borders, for example. Yeah. And I'm just finding it genuinely frustrating.
Yeah, I've had one cab driver yesterday who said, he had such great language for it. Like is like, and it's his reason for getting out. He was really happy where you guys are exiting. And then one the day before who was just miserable about it. So it just like this crazy range. I don't have an answer for you at all about this. I go back to my studio, social, and civic, which I think is a really interesting way to think about our skills and our knowledge base. There may be, and could we possibly not fight each other, but be an allies around those of us who might work on the problem of borders and passports, and being an ally and all that. People who are actually making work about it and calling attention to work. Yeah, you asked a huge question, and I don't know. I used to, I felt strongly in my early years, all my early work was highly political. Like all of my pieces were political, because I was trying to advance the idea that subject matter could be anything, not just love and death, but actually politics was as personal to me. And I still believe in that, but right now I just feel it's so much more about participation. And that's the closest I can get to that. But maybe we do a couple more, and then I want.
See, you're cheeky, you lot.
So
yes, you've got.
Just a quick
yeah,
one.
yeah.
Sorry.
I know this person.
Is it sometimes about choice? Everything's about choice, whether if it's black and white, if it's Labour, Conservative, or whatever, Remain or Brexit. But if we're not happy with those two choices, to come up with another choice, to find your own alternative and narrative. And a very ridiculous but quite relevant example is Billie Jean King in the 70s.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, so we had the Battle of the Sexes. And when she found out the men were getting paid, I think $12,000 to win a tournament, and they were getting paid $1,500. And so she decided to boycott she wouldn't sign the contract, and she took a load of women with her, and they made their own circuit. And I think maybe if we're frustrated with the choice that we are presented with, to find an alternative and ask another question.
Well, and also what you're saying, I mean, again, at home, I would say the gateway to somebody having an artistic career, people are tired of waiting in line. And so people are making all kinds of alternative systems that are really exciting and really interesting, and in effect are causing this to happen. Just by the sheer numbers of people who are saying, I'm not going to wait till I can climb up here. I'm pushing now, which I love. And lots of interesting shapes inside of that, yeah.
I'm going to wrap us up. I want to say a few things first. One is that Liz might not have been able to succinctly answer that question on the back row, but having read this book, I absolutely know that you will at some point. Hiking Horizontally is singularly the most comforting thing and the most inspiring book I've ever read in my entire creative life. So if any of you got questions about anything, about why you do what you do, and if you've got that thing where you're going to get tapped on the shoulder, I mean, you're going to get told to sit down and stop doing your job, if you feel that, like I do most days, this book is everything you've ever wanted it to be. I want to say a huge thank you to Liz for her speech today. If you missed anything that we said, then it's going on. This interview will be online on the Dance Umbrella website from Friday. And the festival, which started today, runs until the 28th of October in the beautiful hands of Emma Gladstone and everybody at Dance Umbrella.
Emma.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Emma. Thank you.